You know what failure tastes like. It's metallic, like biting the inside of your cheek until it bleeds, while standing on the sidewalk, watching your older brother ring the opening bell on Wall Street. With your code, your sleepless nights, your company, I died in the freezing rain, outside that building, clutching a meaningless bankruptcy. Notice my chest tearing apart as my heart finally gave out. But death didn't stick. Now I'm sitting across from him 5 years earlier, and he's sliding that same fatal contract across the desk. The rain didn't stop when my heart did. That was the first thing that struck me as odd. I remember the asphalt of Wall Street. It smelled like wet wool exhaust fumes and the stale grease from a nearby pretzel cart. The pain in my chest wasn't cinematic. It didn't feel like a sudden dramatic explosion. It was a slow, crushing vice. It felt like a rusted iron beam was being tightened around my ribs. My knees had hit the freezing puddles soaking through the cheap slacks I'd worn to my bankruptcy hearing. Up on the massive digital billboard above the street, Colin's face was glowing 50 feet tall, grinning as confetti rained down on the stock exchange floor. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit. I was dying in a puddle. The darkness that took me wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating heavy, with the phantom sound of camera shutters and my brother's booming rehearsed laugh. Then came the jolt. It wasn't a spiritual awakening. It was the physical shock of inhaling a lungful of hot, dry, dust-choked air. I gasped a harsh, jagged sound that scraped my throat and my eyes snapped open. There was no wet asphalt, no towering skyscrapers, no freezing rain. I was staring at a water stain on a popcorn ceiling. It was shaped roughly like a bruised lung. I knew that stain. I had stared at it for 18 months while trying to sleep on a futon that smelled permanently of cheap pepperoni. In desperation, I bolted upright and the world spun. My hand flew to my chest, my fingers digging through the fabric of a faded band t-shirt, searching for the tear, the rupture, the fatal pressure. Nothing. Just the rapid, terrifyingly strong thud of a healthy heart. My skin was slick with a cold sweat, but the room was stiflingly hot. What? The word cracked in my dry mouth. I swung my legs over the edge of the futon. The floor was covered in a jigsaw puzzle of tangled power cords and empty energy drink cans. The ambient noise wasn't the roar of Manhattan traffic. It was the rhythmic, high-pitched whine of 3 server racks stacked precariously in the corner of the garage. Our garage, the incubator. I staggered toward the small, smudged mirror hanging on the back of the hollow core door. The face, looking back at me, was mine, but wrong. The deep, purple bags under my eyes were there, but the permanent gray pallor of the last few years was gone. The deep lines, carved around my mouth by endless lawsuits and panic attacks, had vanished. I looked 26, because I was. I lunged for the cluttered desk, knocking over a half-empty mug of coffee. The liquid spilled thick and cold across a stack of printed code. I didn't care. I grabbed the heavy plastic bezel of the old monitor and shook the mouse to wake it up. The screen flickered to life. The glare burned my eyes. October 14th. I stopped breathing. The hum of the servers seemed to fade into a dull roar in my ears. October 14th. The day Colin was coming. The day he was driving down from his mid-level marketing job in the city to help his little brother out. The day I signed over 51% of the voting rights to him because I was drowning in the logistics of running a business, and he promised to handle the adults while I played with the computers. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until I saw bursts of static. This wasn't a dying dream. Dying dreams don't have the distinct sharp smell of spilled acidic dark roast coffee and burnt ozone. Dying dreams don't have a sticky N key on the keyboard. This was real. The universe, in some bizarre glitching spasm, had hit a reset button. My stomach gave a violent lurch. I dropped to my knees, crawling frantically to the metal trash can by the workbench, and dry heaved into it. The smell of old banana peels and crumpled paper hit my nose. I gripped the cold, rolled steel edge of the can, taking deep, shuddering breaths. I survived. Or I went back. The mechanics of it didn't matter. What mattered was the metallic taste, still lingering in the back of my mouth, the memory of the pavement. A heavy, deliberate knock rattled the garage door. Knock, knock. Pause. Knock. Colin's signature knock. Confident. Assuming. Owning whatever space he was about to enter. I slowly stood up, wiping a bead of sweat from my temple. My hands were shaking. I looked at the desk, where a thick stack of heavy stock paper sat neatly in a manila folder. The operating agreement. I wiped my mouth on the back of my sleeve. I didn't feel heroic. I felt like a rat that had just been pulled out of a flooded trap, shivering and terrified. But as I stared at that folder, the terror began to curdle, hardening into something dense cold and profoundly ugly. "It's open," I said, my voice eerily calm. The side door creaked, the hinges scraping in that familiar agonizing pitch I always meant to oil, but never did. Colin stepped into the garage, and the temperature in the room immediately felt different. He had a way of doing that. He didn't just occupy space, he consumed it. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit off the rack, but tailored perfectly to hide his slight slouch. His shoes clicked sharply on the concrete floor. "Jesus, Artie," he said, waving a hand in front of his face. "It smells like a locker room in here. Don't you ever crack the door." He smiled. It was the same smile that had beamed down at me from the Times Square billboard, warm white and entirely hollow. He smelled of sandalwood and expensive mints. It was the smell of a man who spent his life convincing other people he had value rather than actually creating it. "I've been working," I said. My voice sounded flat to my own ears. I didn't move toward him. I just stood by the trash can, watching him. "I know you have, buddy," he said, stepping over a tangle of Ethernet cables with practiced ease. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight, a little too tight, establishing dominance disguised as affection. The contact made my skin crawl. 5 years of memory. 5 years of him bleeding my accounts dry, isolating me from the board, and eventually locking me out of the building I bought. Screamed at me to push him away. I forced myself to stand still. I let him leave his hand there for 3 seconds before I casually stepped out of his reach and moved toward the desk. "So," Colin said, clapping his hands together and rubbing his palms. "Big day. You got the paperwork from the lawyers." "I printed it last night," I said. I looked down at the manila folder. This was the moment. In the original timeline, I had practically thrown the pen at the paper. I had been so exhausted, so paralyzed by the looming threat of server costs, legal incorporation, and the sheer terror of talking to venture capitalists that Colin looked like a savior. He had offered to take the boring stuff off my hands. He slid into the cheap rolling chair opposite my desk. The chair squeaked in protest. He pulled the folder toward him, opening it with a flourish. "Look, Artie, I was looking over the draft they emailed me." Colin started his tone, dropping an octave into his serious business voice. 51% voting rights to me, 49 to you. I know it looks a little skewed on paper, but you have to understand how investors think. They don't want to talk to the engineer. No offense. They want a face. They want stability. They want someone who understands market dynamics. If we go in 50-50, it's a deadlock risk. Capital hates deadlocks. It was the exact same speech. Verbatim. He had probably rehearsed it in the mirror of his overpriced leased apartment this morning. And the equity split, I asked. He didn't miss a beat. 60-40 my favor. Again, just standard stuff for the CEO versus the CTO. I'm taking on the fiduciary risk, the legal liability. You just get to sit here in your sweatpants and write the magic code. I'm shielding you, man. He reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy black Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it with a soft, satisfying click and held it out to me. The gold nib caught the harsh light of the bare bulb overhead. Dad would be proud of us, you know. Colin added softly, his eyes dropping slightly. Building something together. He always said we needed to look out for each other. There it was, the hook, the emotional leverage. I stared at the pen. My right hand twitched. Muscle memory is a terrifying thing. A part of my brain, the part conditioned by 26 years of being the little brother, wanted to take the pen. It wanted to please him. It wanted the pat on the head. I reached out and took the pen. The resin barrel was warm from his body heat. It felt heavy, too heavy. I pulled the contract toward me. I looked down at the signature line. Alizio Wilson, founder. The silence in the garage was absolute, save for the whining servers. Colin leaned back in the squeaky chair, crossing his legs, a look of profound, smug satisfaction settling over his features. He had won. He always won. I pressed the gold nib against the thick parchment paper. A tiny droplet of black ink bled into the fibers, forming a tiny dark starburst. I closed my eyes. The smell of sandalwood faded. Suddenly, I tasted wet asphalt again. I felt the freezing rain on the back of my neck. I saw the bankruptcy papers fluttering out of my numb hands, ruined by the water. I felt the sharp, agonizing tear in my left ventricle. I opened my eyes. The cold sweat was back prickling along my hairline. I lifted the pen off the paper. I didn't hand it back to him. I just let it drop from my fingers. It hit the desk with a heavy hollow clatter and rolled off the edge, landing on the concrete floor. No, I said. Colin didn't move for a full second. His brain was failing to process the input. The script had broken. No. What? He asked, a nervous chuckle escaping his throat. He leaned over to pick up the pen, wiping the barrel on his pants. Did you smudge it? We can print another copy. No, I repeated. The word tasted better this time. It tasted like oxygen. I'm not signing it. Colin stopped wiping the pen. His eyes locked onto mine, and the affable older brother mask slipped just a fraction of an inch. Beneath it, there was something sharp and calculating. Artie, we talked about this. The lawyers drafted it. This is the path forward. It's a path, I said, leaning my palms flat against the desk. The laminate was cold. It grounded me. But it's not the one we're taking. I wrote every line of this routing algorithm, Colin. I built the architecture. I've been awake for 3 days, making sure the beta doesn't crash. You want 51% of the voting rights and 60% of the equity because you, own a suit, know how to order a decent bottle of wine at a steakhouse. A flush of red crept up Colin's neck, staining his collar. I bring the business acumen, he said, his voice dropping the friendly pretense, turning tight and defensive. "You're a code monkey, Alicio. A brilliant one, sure, but you can't run a company. You stutter when you talk to the pizza guy. You think Sequoia Capital is going to hand you $10 million because you have a neat algorithm. They'll eat you alive." "Maybe," I said. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but it wasn't failing. It was fighting. But if I'm going to get eaten alive, I'd rather it be by strangers than by my own brother. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the garage felt thick, like the moments right before a thunderstorm breaks. Colin stared at me. He was searching my face, looking for the tell, looking for the hesitation he was so used to exploiting. But there was nothing for him to find. The terrified, naive kid he had come to manipulate was dead on a sidewalk in Manhattan. I was just the ghost that came back to haunt him. "You're having a panic attack," Colin said finally. His tone was smooth, patronizing. He stood up, towering over the desk. "You haven't slept. You've been living on caffeine and garbage. You're losing your nerve." He reached for the contract, pulling it back toward his side of the desk. "I'll leave this here. You get some sleep. Call me tomorrow when you're thinking clearly. We'll get a notary on Monday." "Don't leave it," I said. I grabbed the edge of the manila folder and pulled it out of his grip. The movement was fast, violent enough to give him pause. I opened the folder, grabbed the thick stack of expensive paper, and tore it in half. The sound of the heavy stock ripping was louder than I expected. I stacked the halves and tore them again. I dropped the shredded pieces into the metal trash can next to my desk. They settled over my dried vomit. "Are you insane?" Colin hissed, stepping back. The flush on his neck had spread to his cheeks. The mask was completely gone now. His eyes were wide, angry, and slightly feral. "Do you know what that cost to draft? I paid out of pocket for that firm." "Then you should have drafted something equitable," I said. I pointed at the side door. "Get out. You need me." "Alicio," Colin shouted, abandoning the low, calm voice entirely. He stepped forward, invading my space. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're going to crash this thing into the ground. You're a liability to yourself. Get out, Colin." My hands were shaking so hard, I had to ball them into fists and press them against my thighs. I wasn't an action hero. I wasn't immune to him. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to apologize, to smooth things over, to keep the peace. The adrenaline was making me dizzy, but the memory of the rain was stronger. "Fine," Colin spat. He buttoned his suit jacket with a sharp, angry jerk. "You want to play CEO, play CEO. Let's see how long it takes before you're begging me to bail you out. But don't expect the same terms when you come crawling back." He turned on his heel and marched toward the door. He didn't look back. He grabbed the handle and yanked it open, slamming the cheap door so hard the flimsy walls of the garage shook, and a fine layer of dust drifted down from the rafters. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. The adrenaline began to crash. My knees buckled, and I fell heavily into the squeaky rolling chair Colin had just vacated. I rested my elbows on my knees and put my head in my hands. What had I just done? I had saved my company, but I had also just alienated the only person who was actively trying to secure our seed funding. In this timeline, I had no connections. I had no idea how to talk to investors. I knew the technology inside and out. I knew how our algorithm could reduce freight shipping inefficiencies by 14% a margin worth billions. But I didn't know how to sell it. Colin was supposed to be the bridge. I had just burned it to ash. The side door squeaked open again. I flinched my head, snapping up, expecting Colin to have returned for another round of psychological warfare. Instead, Sophie walked in. She was carrying a cardboard drink carrier with 2 massive iced coffees. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, held together by a plastic claw clip that looked like it was crying for help. She wore an oversized flannel shirt over a faded tank top, and she had a smudge of blue ink on her chin. Sophie was my lead developer. In the old timeline, she had quit 3 years and unable to stomach Colin's toxic management style, and the pivot he forced away from our core technology toward a flashy, useless consumer app. We hadn't spoken since she left. I had missed her brilliance, her dry cynicism, and her brutal honesty. I saw Colin storming out to his BMW, Sophie said, kicking the door shut behind her with her heel. She walked over and set a sweating iced coffee on my desk, pushing aside the spilled mug. He looked like he just swallowed a wasp, which, by the way, I fully support. She took a sip of her own coffee, wincing at the bitterness. She looked around the garage, her eyes landing on the torn shreds of heavy paper sitting on top of the trash in the bin. She paused, the straw still in her mouth. She looked from the trash can back to me. She noted my pale face, my shaking hands, the absolute wreck I was in. "Okay," Sophie said slowly, her tone shifting from casual banter to sharp, focused assessment. She set her coffee down and leaned against the edge of my desk, crossing her arms. "I thought today was the day you signed your soul and our code base over to Patrick Bateman." "I didn't sign it," I whispered. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. Sophie's eyebrows shot up. A slow, incredulous smile spread across her face. "You didn't, holy shit, Wilson. I didn't think you had it in you to tell him no." "Neither did I." I let out a breath that sounded like a ragged laugh. "But I did. He's out. He's completely out." Sophie's smile faded slightly as the reality of the situation hit her pragmatic brain. She picked up a dry erase marker from the desk and began turning it over in her ink-stained fingers. "Okay," she said, her voice dropping into the calm, methodical tone she used when a server crashed and we were losing data by the second. "That's good. Morally, mentally, that's fantastic. But logistically, Artie, we have $300 in the business account. The AWS bill is due in 10 days, and we need to run the stress test on the new nodes. Colin was supposed to bring in the angel guy next week." "I know," I said, rubbing my face. "Do you have a backup plan?" she asked. "Because if we don't get funding this month, we have to shut the servers down. The algorithm dies." I looked up at her. In the old timeline, I had let Colin steer the ship into the rocks because I was too afraid to grab the wheel. I wasn't that guy anymore. I knew exactly who wanted this tech. I knew who Colin was going to pitch, who he ignored, and who eventually bought our competitors. I had 5 years of future market knowledge locked in my head. "I have a plan," I said, sitting up straighter. The panic was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but the clarity was returning. "But we're going to have to rebuild the pitch deck from scratch, and we need to pivot the beta test. We're not targeting commercial freight anymore." Sophie squinted at me, the marker pausing in her hand. "What? Then who are we targeting?" "Sarah. Medical supply chains." I said the words, falling out of my mouth with absolute certainty. I remembered the crisis that was coming in 18 months, the logistical nightmare that would paralyze the industry. They don't know it yet, but their infrastructure is about to collapse, and we're going to be the only ones holding the safety net. Sophie stared at me, for a long, silent moment. She looked for the hesitation, the doubt that usually clouded my decisions. When she didn't find it, she nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "All right, Wilson," she said, pulling a rolling whiteboard toward the center of the room. She uncapped the marker. "Tell me what we're building." Pivots in movies happen over a catchy synth soundtrack. Real pivots happen in absolute soul-crushing silence, punctuated only by the aggressive clacking of a mechanical keyboard and the occasional sound of someone weeping in a bathroom. For the next 8 days, the garage became a submarine. We didn't see the sun. We breathed recycled air that tasted like ozone and stale cumin from the mountain of cheap curry takeout boxes piling up by the utility sink. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain misfired, supplying the phantom sensation of rain freezing on my skin and the crushing weight on my chest. I'd jerk awake, gasping my shirt, clinging to my back, and stare at the blinking cursor on my terminal until my heart rate dropped back out of the danger zone. So, I coded. I rewrote the core routing logic, stripping out the massive, clunky parameters Colin had insisted we include for commercial trucking. I narrowed the focus: medical supplies, cold chain logistics, blood, vaccines, insulin, things that expired, things that couldn't sit on a loading dock in Fresno for 3 days because a dispatcher misread a spreadsheet. Sophie was a machine, but even machines need oil. By day 6, the blue ink smudge on her chin had been replaced by dark, bruise-like shadows under her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her mug. "The latency is down to 4 milliseconds," she rasped, her voice completely shot from disuse and caffeine dehydration. She didn't look away from her vertical monitor. The glare painted her pale face in harsh geometric lines of blue and white. But if they hit the API with more than 10,000 concurrent requests, the AWS load balancer is going to choke. We can't afford the Tier 2 infrastructure. We won't need it for the demo, I said, rubbing my knuckles against my gritty eyes. My fingers smelled faintly of oxidized copper from replacing a burnt-out motherboard relay the night before. We just need it to hold together for 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Sophie repeated, a hollow laugh scraping her throat. Right. No pressure. Have you even emailed him yet? I looked at the drafted email on my secondary screen. To david.holden@holdenventures.com. Subject Logistics API Demo. Reducing cold chain spoilage by 14%. David Holden. In the original timeline, Colin had pitched him our freight routing software 6 months from now. Holden had laughed Colin out of the room, correctly identifying my brother as a slick, empty suit who didn't understand his own tech. But Holden was a logistics fanatic. A year after he rejected Colin, Holden made a fortune investing heavily in medical supply chain optimization just before the market bottlenecked. I was going to give him the solution 18 months early. "I'm sending it now," I said. My finger hovered over the left mouse button. Doubt thick and suffocating wrapped around my throat. I was an engineer. I wrote code. I didn't write pitch emails to cutthroat venture capitalists. I could hear Colin's voice in my head, a smug whisper. "You stutter when you talk to the pizza guy. They'll eat you alive." I grit my teeth, the tension shooting up into my jaw. I clicked send. The notification pinged. The email was gone. "Sent," I muttered. Sophie finally turned away from her screen. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, the only expensive piece of furniture in the garage, bought used from a defunct startup, and looked at me. "You look like a corpse, Artie." "I feel like one," I admitted, staring blankly at the empty inbox. "Go shower," she ordered, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "You smell like panic and old onions. If he replies, I'll text you. If he doesn't, well, I have $20 left on my credit card. We can buy a really nice bottle of cheap vodka and watch the servers power down." I didn't argue. I dragged myself up from the desk. My joints popped in protest, a symphony of neglect. The walk from the garage to the tiny, cramped bathroom inside the main house felt like a trek across a desert. The shower water was lukewarm. The water heater was dying, but it felt like a baptism. I stood under the weak spray, pressing my forehead against the cheap fiberglass enclosure, letting the water run over my closed eyes. Bzzzt. My phone vibrated on the toilet tank. I froze. I wiped the water from my eyes, practically tore the shower curtain off its plastic rings, and grabbed the phone. My wet thumb slipped twice on the screen before I unlocked it. A text from Sophie. "He wants to see it. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. The warehouse in Oakland." I stared at the screen, the lukewarm water dripping from my hair onto the glass. The air in my lungs turned to ice. Tomorrow. We had 13 hours to ensure the demo didn't crash, and I had 13 hours to figure out how to pretend I was a CEO. The Holden Logistics Hub in Oakland wasn't a sleek corporate office. It was a working distribution center, a massive concrete cavern situated next to the docks, smelling intensely of diesel fuel, wet cardboard, and the metallic tang of the San Francisco Bay. I stood in the visitor parking lot at 8:45 a.m. wearing a gray suit I had bought for a funeral 3 years ago. It didn't fit right. The shoulders were too wide, and the fabric was stiff and cheap. I kept tugging at the collar, feeling the coarse thread scratch against my neck. I had a heavy, battered laptop bag slung over one shoulder. Inside was my entire life. The laptop containing the local instance of our API, the backup hard drive, and a physical printout of the code, just in case the universe decided to fry all electronics within a 5-mile radius. I was entirely prepared for disaster. The walk to the front entrance felt exactly like the walk to my bankruptcy hearing. My legs were heavy. The metallic taste of failure was already pooling under my tongue. I swallowed it down, forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other. The receptionist didn't offer me sparkling water. She just pointed a chipped acrylic fingernail toward a steel door down a hallway painted in industrial, institutional green. I pushed the door open. The blast of air conditioning was aggressive, freezing the sweat that had gathered on the back of my neck. The room wasn't a boardroom. It was a dispatch office overlooking the warehouse floor through a wall of soundproof glass. Below, forklifts zipped like angry yellow insects around pallets of medical supplies. David Holden sat behind a scratched metal desk. He didn't look like a venture capitalist. He looked like a foreman who had been forced to put on a button-down shirt. He had a thick neck, a square jaw covered in graying stubble, and eyes the color of dirty ice. He was drinking something dark out of a styrofoam cup. He didn't stand when I walked in. He just stared at me. "Alicia Wilson," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. He glanced at his watch. "You're 5 minutes early. I hate when people are early. It means they're desperate. Or respectful of your time." I fired back my voice, tighter and higher than I wanted it to be. Holden snorted. It wasn't a friendly sound. "Sit down. Let's see this 14% you promised in the email." I practically dropped into the plastic chair opposite his desk. It squeaked, reminding me painfully of Colin sitting in my garage. I unzipped the bag. My hands were shaking. I could see them shaking. Holden could see them shaking. You're a code monkey, Alicio. Colin's voice echoed in my head. I pulled the laptop out and slammed it onto the metal desk, perhaps a bit too hard. I opened the lid, the screen booting up instantly to the dashboard Sophie had hastily designed the night before. I don't have a PowerPoint, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I took a deep breath, trying to push the air all the way down into my stomach. I don't have a marketing team. I just have the math. Good. Holden grunted, leaning forward. PowerPoints are for liars. I turned the laptop so he could see it. The screen showed a map of the West Coast covered in a dense, tangled web of red lines, current medical supply routes based on open-source dispatch data. This is the current cold chain routing model for blood and temperature-sensitive biologics from Seattle to San Diego. I said. My voice was gaining traction. The moment I started talking about the data, the panic receded, replaced by the cold, comforting logic of the system. It's entirely reactive. A truck hits traffic in Portland. The dispatcher manually reroutes, but they don't account for the ambient temperature of the secondary route or the fuel delay. Spoilage rates hover around 6%. It's a massive bleeding wound in the logistics chain. Holden took a slow sip from his styrofoam cup. Tell me something I don't know, kid. I know that next year, the FDA is changing the temperature tolerance mandates for insulin transport. I lied. It wasn't a lie. It was the truth from my timeline. But to him, it was a bold prediction. When that happens, your 6% spoilage rate jumps to 11%. Your profit margins get wiped out in regulatory fines. Holden stopped drinking. The cup hovered an inch from his mouth. His dirty ice eyes narrowed. Nobody knows what the FDA is going to do. I do, I said, looking him dead in the eye. I didn't blink. The desperation had crystallized into something hard and sharp, because the current model is unsustainable. The infrastructure is cracking. I hit the enter key. The screen flickered. The tangled web of red lines dissolved. In its place, a clean, elegant network of blue lines snapped into existence. The routes shifted dynamically, curving around predicted traffic bottlenecks, prioritizing high-altitude passes during peak heat hours to reduce refrigeration load on the trucks. This is our API, I said, tapping the screen with a trembling finger. It doesn't react. It predicts. It pulls in real-time meteorological data, municipal traffic camera feeds, and historical delay patterns to dynamically reroute cold chain shipments before they hit the bottleneck. It calculates the optimal route, not just by distance, but by thermal exposure. I pointed to a specific node in Los Angeles. We ran a simulation of your fleet's data from last quarter. We didn't save you time. We saved your cargo. 14.2% reduction in thermal violation alerts. Holden stared at the screen. The only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioner and the muffled beeping of a forklift reversing down on the warehouse floor. He leaned closer to the monitor. He reached out and scrolled the trackpad, tracing a blue line down the I-5 corridor. You built this? He asked, not looking at me. My lead developer and I said. Who's the CEO? The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. This was the trap. In the old timeline, Colin would have puffed out his chest, flashed his Pepsodent smile, and claimed the title, taking the credit, while fundamentally misunderstanding the product. I looked at my hands. They were resting on my knees, the knuckles white. I was terrified, but I was more terrified of dying in the rain again. I am, I said. The words felt foreign in my mouth, heavy. I'm the founder. I'm the CEO. I write the code, and I run the company." Holden finally looked up from the screen. He studied my face, taking in the cheap suit, the dark bags under my eyes, the absolute lack of polish. He saw exactly what I was, an exhausted, desperate engineer who was playing entirely out of his depth. But he also saw the math. "You look like shit, Alicio," Holden said bluntly. "I haven't slept in a week," I replied, the honesty slipping out before I could stop it. Holden stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward in a grim, acknowledging smirk. "Good," he said, setting the styrofoam cup down on the desk. "Sleep is for people who aren't trying to change the world. How much do you need to keep the servers on?" The wire transfer hit our business account on a Thursday at 2:14 p.m. It was $1.5 million, $1,500,000. I stood in the middle of the garage, staring at the banking app on my phone through a web of cracks on the screen. The numbers looked fake, like a placeholder graphic you'd see in a software tutorial. I refreshed the page. The numbers stayed. I didn't cheer. I didn't pop a bottle of champagne. I walked over to the utility sink, gripped the cold, chalky porcelain edges, and leaned forward until my forehead touched the dirty mirror. I exhaled, a long, rattling breath that tasted like bile and old coffee left my lungs, and for the first time in 5 years, across 2 lifetimes, I felt the iron band around my chest loosen. Just a fraction. Just enough to let the oxygen in. "Did it clear?" Sophie asked. She didn't look up from her monitor. She was typing furiously, the mechanical keyboard clacking like a machine gun. "Yeah," I said. My voice was a hollow rasp. "It cleared. Turn on the Tier 2 servers." Within 3 weeks, the garage was empty. We leased a 2,000 square foot, brutalist concrete box in an industrial park just outside Emeryville. It smelled intensely of off-gassing synthetic carpet glue and the industrial bleach the janitorial staff used on the baseboards. It was ugly, it was drafty, and it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. But the relief of survival is a fleeting drug. The stress didn't vanish. It simply mutated. Instead of worrying about the electric bill, I was worrying about payroll taxes, health insurance compliance, and the sheer, terrifying velocity of scaling an infrastructure that handled live data. I had to hire engineers. I had to interview people who were older, smarter, and far more qualified than I was. And I had to convince them to follow a 26-year-old kid whose only business attire was a rotation of clean, dark T-shirts. The imposter syndrome was a physical weight. It sat right behind my sternum, a cold, hard knot that throbbed whenever I had to sign my name on an employment contract. Every time I led a stand-up meeting, I waited for someone to point a finger and laugh, to expose me as the terrified fraud I felt I was. But they didn't, because the code worked. By month 4, the API was actively routing 15% of Holden's West Coast cold chain logistics. Our spoilage reduction held steady at 13.8%. We weren't just saving the money. We were saving raw, critical inventory. I was standing by the communal coffee machine one Tuesday, trying to decipher the complex, flashing LED error code on the grinder, when Sophie walked into the break room. She wasn't carrying her laptop. She was carrying a thick, rigid envelope made of heavy, cream-colored paper. She dropped it onto the counter next to the sugar packets. It hit the laminate with a heavy, ominous thud. "Process server, just drop this off at the front desk," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of its usual sarcastic lilt. I looked at the return address. Caldwell Vance and Stern, LLP, a massive predatory corporate litigation firm based in San Francisco. The cold knot behind my sternum flared, shooting a spike of pure adrenaline straight into my throat. My fingers went numb. I reached for the envelope, tearing the reinforced flap open. The paper sliced the pad of my thumb a sharp, sudden sting, but I barely felt it. I pulled out the thick stack of stapled documents. It was a lawsuit. Colin Wilson versus Alicia Wilson in Rootcore Logistics Incorporated. I scanned the dense, aggressive legalese. Breach of oral contract, intellectual property theft, fraudulent inducement. Colin was claiming that he was a co-founder, that the original routing algorithm was built using his strategic business directives, and that I had illegally ousted him prior to securing venture funding to steal his equity. He wasn't just asking for 51%. He was asking for an injunction to freeze our operations until the dispute was settled. He was trying to shut the servers down. He's suing us, I whispered, the words tasting like copper. I can read upside down, Artie, Sophie said, crossing her arms. Her jaw was set tight. He wants an injunction. If they freeze, our IP Holden will pull his contract instantly. They can't route medical supplies on legally contested software. It's a liability nightmare. Colin didn't want the company. He knew he couldn't run it. He wanted to hold it hostage. He was betting that Holden Ventures would force me to settle, to pay him millions, to go away, rather than risk their supply chain shutting down. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was exactly what he had done in the old timeline to force me out of the CEO chair. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, terrified bird trapped in a cage. I felt the phantom rain on my skin. I smelled the wet asphalt of Wall Street. The panic attack clawed at my throat, threatening to drag me under. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heel of my uninjured hand hard against my chest. I am alive. The heart is healthy. It's just a piece of paper. What do we do? Sophie asked, her voice cracking just a fraction. For the first time, she looked genuinely scared. I opened my eyes. I looked down at the cut on my thumb. A single bright red bead of blood had welled up, smearing a dark streak across the crisp legal paper. It wasn't phantom pain. It was real. The terror receded, leaving behind a slow, creeping burn of absolute toxic anger. We don't settle, I said. I wiped the blood off my thumb onto my jeans. I picked up the lawsuit. Call Holden. Tell him we have a parasite and we need to use his legal team to extract it. The conference room at Caldwell Vance and Stern smelled like money. It was a specific scent, lemon oil polish, old leather, and the subtle, sterile tang of high-end HVAC filtration. The table was a massive slab of dark mahogany that looked heavy enough to crush a car. I sat on one side, flanked by two of Holden's absolute apex predators, a senior litigator named Pierce, who spoke entirely in quiet, threatening murmurs, and a corporate structuring attorney who was currently filing her nails with a glass file radiating bored contempt. The heavy glass door swung open, and Colin walked in. He paused for a microsecond when he saw the two lawyers bracketing me, but he recovered instantly. He was wearing a new suit, a Tom Ford, if I had to guess. He looked perfectly tailored, aggressively handsome, and utterly confident. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man with slicked-back hair, trailed behind him like a remora attached to a shark. Colin sat down directly across from me. He didn't look at my lawyers. He looked at me, fixing me with that warm, affable, deeply manipulative older brother smile. "Artie," he said softly, "you look tired. I told you running a company would eat you up." In the past, that tone would have triggered a Pavlovian response. I would have folded my shoulders. I would have looked down. I would have felt the sudden crushing guilt of disappointing him. Now I just felt exhausted. Looking at him was like looking at a ghost or a phantom limb that still ached when it rained. He was my brother, but the man I thought I knew had died long before I ever collapsed on that sidewalk. "Let's skip the family reunion." "Colin," I said. My voice was level empty of the tremor that usually haunted it. "You're suing me for IP theft." Colin's smile thinned just a fraction. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table. "I'm protecting my investment. We built this together in the garage, Alicio. I brought you the market perspective. I drafted the initial operating structures. You pushed me out the moment Holden dangled a check. It's bad business, and honestly, it's a betrayal." He sounded so incredibly genuine. If I hadn't lived through the alternate reality where his strategic directives drove the company into a brick wall of debt, I might have believed him. His lawyer cleared his throat, opening a leather binder. "We are prepared to file the injunction tomorrow morning. However, my client is amenable to a pre-trial settlement. A 30% equity stake and a seat on the board, recognizing his foundational contributions. It saves everyone a messy public battle." Pierce, my litigator, didn't even look up from his notepad. He just let out a soft, dry chuckle that sounded like sandpaper on wood. 30%, I repeated. I looked at Colin. "You want a third of my company for telling me the garage smelled bad and printing off a boilerplate LLC agreement you downloaded for free." Colin's eyes hardened. The mask was slipping. "I built the foundation, you ungrateful little prick. You wouldn't even know how to spell CEO without me." I reached into my cheap canvas messenger bag. I didn't have a leather binder. I pulled out a single, thin manila folder and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped, precisely, in front of Colin. "What is this?" his lawyer asked, reaching for it. "It's a digital forensic audit," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Conducted last week by a third-party cybersecurity firm hired by Holden Ventures." Colin frowned, opening the folder. "It details every single keystroke, every commit, every line of code, written for the root core algorithm." I continued the words, flowing with cold precision. "It proves mathematically that 100% of the proprietary architecture was authored on my local machine and Sophie's local machine. It also contains the access logs for the AWS servers. You never logged in. You never viewed the code base. You couldn't even if you tried, because you don't know Python from a hole in the ground." Colin stared at the top sheet of the report. A faint red flush began to crawl up his neck. "Code isn't the whole business." Colin snapped his voice, rising, losing its smooth cadence. "I provided strategic direction. You provided a toxic work environment in an attempt to extort 51% of my voting rights through emotional manipulation." I said. My heart was beating steadily. The air in my lungs was cool and clear. "And you have zero documentation to prove otherwise. No emails, no texts, nothing. Because you didn't do a damn thing." I leaned forward, mirroring his posture, but I didn't smile. "You file that injunction, Colin and Holden's legal team won't just crush it. They will countersue you for malicious prosecution and tortious interference. They will drag you through discovery for the next 5 years. They will subpoena your bank records, your texts, your browser history. They will make you completely unemployable in this valley. Silence descended on the room, thick and heavy. Colin's lawyer looked at the forensic report, then slowly looked at Colin. He realized in real time that his client had lied to him about his level of involvement. Colin stared at me. The smug superiority was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, naked hatred that made my skin crawl. He was looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was a monster. "You're dead to me, Alicio." Colin hissed, his voice vibrating with venom. "Dad would be disgusted by what you've become." The mention of our father was the final desperate blade he had left. 5 years ago, it would have gutted me. Now, it just bounced off. "Dad was a mechanic who actually knew how to fix things," I said quietly. "He wouldn't recognize you." I stood up. My legs were perfectly steady. I buttoned my cheap jacket. "The offer is 0% $0, and you never contact me or my employees again," I said, looking down at him. "Withdraw the suit by 5 p.m., or Pierce starts filing the counterclaims. Have a nice life, Colin." I turned and walked out of the conference room. I didn't look back to see his reaction. As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, I stepped into the elevator lobby. I waited for the crash. I waited for the guilt, the sorrow of severing my last living family tie. But as the elevator chimed and the doors slid open, all I felt was the startling, weightless sensation of a ghost finally putting itself to rest. I was free. 18 months later, the sky didn't fall. It just froze. The FDA mandate hit the wires on a Tuesday in November, exactly as I remembered. The new thermal tolerance regulations for biological transport were brutal, immediate, and completely unforgiving. Overnight, the standard operating procedures for every major medical supplier in North America became obsolete. Dispatchers panicked. Shipping lanes clogged. Trucks sat idling at way stations while their refrigerated trailers burned through diesel, desperately trying to keep the cargo within the new 2-degree margin of error. By Thursday, the spoilage reports started leaking to the press. Millions of dollars of insulin plasma and pediatric vaccines were turning to useless slush on the asphalt of a dozen different interstate highways. The market choked. We didn't. Inside the root core control room, a massive glass-walled nerve center in our new San Jose headquarters that smelled of industrial floor wax and hot silicon, the ambient temperature was a heavily regulated 68 degrees. We were routing 40% of the West Coast's critical medical freight. I stood behind Sophie's chair, watching the primary display monitor. The map wasn't the tangled red web of our competitors. It was a fluid-breathing organism of sharp blue lines, instantly shifting cargo away from a gridlocked I-10 corridor in Arizona, anticipating a localized heat spike before the National Weather Service even issued the warning. 0.4% thermal violation rate, Sophie said. Her voice was raspy, a permanent casualty of the last year and a half of relentless scaling. She rubbed her eyes, pulling a pair of blue light glasses down to the bridge of her nose. Holden is crying tears of joy on line 3. He says we just saved his quarterly earnings. Tell him his invoice is going up by 20% next month, I replied, my voice flat. I wasn't euphoric. I was tired. It was a different kind of tired than the garage days. Back then, exhaustion was a sharp, biting animal chewing on my ankles. Now it was a heavy leaden blanket draped over my shoulders. The imposter syndrome had finally burned away, replaced by the cold, mechanical reality of being responsible for the physical infrastructure that kept people alive. If I made a mistake, now a hospital in Portland, ran out of O-negative blood. The stakes had calcified my nerves. I walked back into my office. It was sparsely decorated. No ping pong tables, no neon startup signs. Just a heavy oak desk, a leather chair, and a panoramic view of the 101 freeway. I sat down and tapped the spacebar on my laptop to wake the screen. My browser was already open to a financial news aggregator. I didn't have to search for his name. It was right there, sitting near the top of the morning's disaster reports. Logistics startup, Aerostream, halts operations amid massive spoilage claims. After I kicked him out, Colin hadn't just walked away. His ego couldn't handle it. He had taken his slick suits, his empty buzzwords, and his deep Rolodex to a rival venture capital firm. He pitched them Aerostream, a blockchain-integrated, AI-driven logistics paradigm. It was vaporware, a shiny hollow shell built entirely on marketing copy and outsourced patchwork code that he barely understood. He had raised $40 million on his smile alone. For a year, he played the part. He bought a penthouse in Soma. He bought a matte black Porsche. He was on the cover of low-tier tech magazines, posing with his arms crossed, talking about disrupting the supply chain. But then, the FDA mandate hit. The tide went out, and Colin was standing there, completely naked. His software didn't predict, it just reacted. When the crisis bottlenecked, the Interstate's Aerostream's algorithm simply routed thousands of trucks directly into the same detours, creating a massive, localized gridlock in Nevada that resulted in the catastrophic spoilage of 300 pallets of raw pharmaceutical precursors. I clicked on a secondary article from a prominent financial journal. SEC opens inquiry into Aerostream CEO Colin Wilson, following allegations of fraudulent tech capabilities. I read the words, waiting for the vindication to hit. I waited for the surge of triumph, the sweet, intoxicating taste of revenge. I thought it would taste like victory. It didn't. It tasted like ash. I picked up my coffee mug. The dark roast had gone cold and bitter. I stared at the screen, looking at a thumbnail photo of Colin dodging a reporter outside a courthouse, his custom-tailored suit looking rumpled. His jaw clenched, his eyes wide and panicked. The affable mask had been violently ripped away, exposing the terrified, hollow man underneath. I felt nothing. No joy, no pity, just a vast, echoing emptiness. He had built his entire life on the premise that he could charm his way out of gravity. But gravity always wins. My phone buzzed against the oak desk. The caller ID flashed. Unknown number. I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up. I pressed the cold glass to my ear. Hello. Silence on the other end. Just the ragged, wet sound of someone breathing heavily. Artie. The voice was thin. It sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. It was Colin. I didn't speak. I just listened to the hum of the HVAC unit in my ceiling. They're freezing my assets, Artie, Colin whispered. The arrogance was completely gone. He sounded exactly like the terrified kid he used to be when our dad yelled at him for breaking a tool in the shed. The board locked me out of the building. The lawyers, they're saying wire fraud because the back end didn't do what the prospectus said it did. He took a shuddering breath. I'm going to prison, Artie. I need a loan, just to cover the retainer for a criminal defense firm. You have it. Root Core is valued at, God, they say it's valued at $1 billion. You have it. We're brothers. I closed my eyes. The phantom smell of sandalwood and expensive mints ghosted through my memory immediately replaced by the metallic tang of wet pavement. "We were," I said. My voice was incredibly calm. "But then, I died Colin." "What?" he stammered, confusion bleeding into his panic. "Artie, what are you talking about? Please, I'm begging you." "I don't have a brother," I said. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. I set the device, face down, on the desk. I didn't block the number. I just walked over to the glass wall, looking down at the endless stream of cars on the freeway, watching the heavy trucks merge into the lanes, carrying things that mattered to people who needed them. New York City smells exactly the same in every timeline. It was late October. I was standing on the corner of Broad and Wall Street. The rain was coming down in sharp, freezing sheets, soaking into the heavy wool of my charcoal overcoat. A pretzel cart a few yards away was venting steam that smelled of stale grease and burned salt. My chest felt entirely normal. I pressed my gloved hand against my sternum. Anyway, feeling the strong, steady rhythm of a healthy left ventricle. There was no iron vice, no tearing sensation, just the cold wind biting at my cheeks. I looked across the street. The massive digital billboard, bolted to the side of the stone facade, was bright enough to cut through the gray afternoon gloom. 5 years ago, in a life that no longer existed, that screen had displayed Colin's grinning face as confetti rained down on his stolen empire right before my heart gave out in a filthy puddle. Today the billboard was displaying the ticker for the New York Stock Exchange. Route Core Logistics had gone public at 9:30 a.m. I hadn't been on the podium to ring the bell. I let Sophie do it. She had earned it. I had watched from the back of the trading floor, standing next to David Holden, sipping a lukewarm coffee, while the room erupted into applause as our stock price opened at $42 a share and immediately began to climb. I tilted my head back, letting the freezing rain hit my face. It didn't feel like death anymore. It just felt like water. A notification buzzed in my pocket. I pulled out my phone, shielding the screen from the rain with my hand. It was a news alert from Bloomberg. Former Aerostream CEO Colin Wilson, sentenced to 41 months in federal prison for defrauding investors. I stared at the black text on the bright screen. The letters felt completely disconnected from my reality. It was a dispatch from a war that had ended a long time ago. I swiped the notification away. Underneath it was a text from Sophie. "Sophie, the underwriters are taking us to some absurdly expensive steakhouse in Tribeca. They ordered a bottle of wine that costs more than my first car. Get here before I accidentally insult them." I typed a quick reply with my cold thumb. "Me. On my way. Don't let them order the seafood tower." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The phantom timeline, the ghost that had haunted my every waking moment for the last 5 years, finally evaporated, washed away by the New York rain. The metallic taste of failure was gone from my mouth, replaced by the lingering bitterness of cheap trading floor coffee. I stepped over a deep puddle on the edge of the curb and hailed a cab. The yellow car splashed through the intersection, stopping in front of me with a squeal of wet brakes. I opened the door, sliding into the warm, dry interior that smelled faintly of pine air freshener and old vinyl. "Tribeca," I told the driver. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, watching the stock exchange fade into the rearview mirror. I didn't look back again. I was alive, the code was running, and I had work to do. If this story gripped you, hit that like button to feed the algorithm and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is simply outbuilding the people who tried to break you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a new narrative. We're dropping gritty, grounded stories like this every week, diving into the messy, complicated realities of ambition, betrayal, and starting over. Drop a comment below telling me which part of Alicia's journey hit you the hardest. Thanks for watching and keep building.